At the outset, I should thank the organizers for choosing this topic. Uh, you know, we are living in interesting times when people want to change the narrative about India and try to install, reinstall democracy in India. So this is a topic where we could, discuss for hours. And I think with eminent panelists and erudite audience like you, 1 hour would be hardly sufficient. Uh, Before coming to the topic, Ramadevji, let me try to play a devil's advocate. Uh, Before coming to the need, uh, this narrative about India, or what we say, the story about India which is prevalent in the world, is there really a story which is uh, there out there, or uh, what is the narrative about India currently? And they say, they say a story which lives is something which somebody wants to listen. So is the world ready to listen, or what is the story about India? Well, since you travel a lot, so what is the story you see about India abroad?
Uh, Firstly, what do we mean by this whole global narrative thing? Just because New York Times did an editorial or Washington Post published an article, does it automatically become the global narrative? First of all, we have to get out of this whole syndrome that there is a global narrative and that is being built by fellows sitting in Washington DC or New York City. There is no such thing, let me tell you. I happened, the Prime Minister of one of our neighboring countries once told me something interesting. He said, see, if I come to Gujarat and try to contest the elections there, people even don't even recognize me. Forget about getting deposits and all that, they don't even recognize me. If Modi ji comes and contests in my country, he is sure to become the Prime Minister of my country. Even I will be defeated. Now, that is a narrative there. There is a narrative there. We come across many such narratives all over the world. So there is no such thing called global narrative. Why we talk about it is because we are overly influenced by what George Soros said or what New York Times wrote. So first of all, India today enjoys great credibility in the West as a country. And you see it in statements of leaders from different parts of the world. I'm just not just talking about what Joe Biden has said when we offered him to buy 270 aircraft from Boeing or 240 aircraft from Boeing. That they will anyway say they are getting money from us. But generally speaking, there is a lot of bullishness about India, a lot of hope about India. The World Bank says that, the International Monetary Fund says that. Is that a narrative or not? But also, there are people who criticize you, who criticize your government, who criticize the leadership, who take up issues and question us. I say that in that where you face some criticism, don't assume that that is the narrative in the world. When you face criticism, you are in public life, try to respond to it. There are two ways of responding to it. One way is to go into that shell and immediately develop that victimhood syndrome. You see, the whole world is conspiring against me. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is place the facts, tell the truth, tell your story, and people will listen. If somebody says, since you mentioned about democracy, if somebody says there is democracy deficit in India, please tell them that in the last 5 years, the current ruling party has lost 17 elections. Tell them. Here democracy thrives in this country. And few more states are going to polls now, few more states will go to polls later this year. So we need to state our story effectively, and these days, many people try to do that more effectively. It is done by our foreign minister. His views are taken very seriously. In fact, his views are quoted by leaders of the other countries today. So we are actually in a way setting the narrative. So firstly, understand global narrative. There is no such thing called one global narrative. There are opinions in the world, but largely, broadly, there is a lot of hope about future of India, the future rise of India. Everybody acknowledges that India is going to be one of the fast rising powers in the next few decades. That is the story today in the world. If there is any global narrative about government, there are views. Let us face them, let us counter them with confidence. Let's not get into that victimhood syndrome. कोई हमारे पीछे लग गया है, कोई नहीं लगा है. There will be establishment everywhere in every system. The same New York Times, same Washington Post. The amount of scorn, the amount of criticism they make about their own government, you should see any time. So that is anti-establishment mindset. Take it, handle it, respond to it. Where necessary, read it.
Professor Nalapat, coming to the story of narratives, for about 200 years, when during colonialism until World War II, it was a Eurocentric narrative, if I can call that. Post World War II, it was US-centric, and currently, as we see, since you cover China a lot, China has been the focus of everything. Every story has China as a major part. Now, conflating these three narratives, how do you see the India narrative shaping up? I mean, should we go for something called India-centrism? Or is there something which, apart from what, Ramadevji said that India story is shaping up, but are we on the right path, or what else do we do so that this India story will shape up in the world?
Yeah, I would like to remind people here, and I think thanks to the internet, it's very accessible. Back in the 1990s, when I talked of India emerging as a major economy, as possibly among the top three in the world, there were a lot of smiles actually about that. Today, frankly, even if one goes abroad, you go to different countries, including China, there are no longer any amused smiles. There is an acknowledgement of that. As far as China is concerned, I have been saying right from the late 1990s that this country is almost on the step of being a superpower or being a superpower. Even the Chinese many scholars are not acknowledging that, but now they are. We are, as Ram correctly said, well on the path to being the third superpower. I was absolutely fascinated by the previous discussion, and actually, I think in my front page report, I think I've mentioned Bharat's comment about some defense equipment. The fact of the matter is that, today's India, and pardon me, I'm not political at all, but I'd like to say that the difference between today's India and the India of the past is that among the mainstream, there is a confidence that this country is headed somewhere. And the reason for that is high targets have been set. I remember, watching I think it was Hindustan Times conclave, and the chairman of the UPA was saying, we shouldn't, when people were talking, outsiders were talking about Indian companies buying up companies in Europe, buying up companies in the United States. Oh, we shouldn't really be talking about that kind of thing. We're actually a very poor country, and maybe we should not have that kind of... The implication was, don't have any high ambitions, because you're really not worth it. Now, you have a class of people in the world. I basically admire Ram's, gung-ho confidence in that. But I'd like to say that there is a class of people in the world who are very unhappy that, if I may say so, India stood up. And like him or not, the fact is that under this Prime Minister, there is a perception that India stood up. First of all, a person coming from the absolute, very, very disenfranchised, disadvantaged section of society rising to this level. Secondly, an individual has clearly got confidence in the Indian people. The entire thinking of a colonial bureaucracy, and some of us make the mistake that, oh, it's the question of language, and we emphasize language. Language is one of the instruments for state power and for societal improvement or degradation, whatever. Language is not more than that. The fact of the matter is that there was no trust in the Indian people. The same lack of trust that was there in the British, that, unless you are nanny, you have this nanny in a British family, the governess, who tells the children what to do. Don't be a naughty boy. So the parent won't, punish the child. The nanny will punish. So nanny knows what to do. Now, as I see, the BBC thought itself to be the nanny of India. And, I've been, unfortunately, I don't like that city, horrible pollution, terrible traffic. I have spent a lot of time in Delhi. And I found, for example, that, you have a situation by which in the previous administration, if you were a foreign correspondent from a particular set of countries, you had entry into any minister's house. If for some reason that minister was busy with some urgent matters of state and could not give you time, there was a complaint to some important locations, and subsequently the minister found the time to meet you. Today,
India is the only competitor of China in Asia. So obviously they'll be trying to kneecap us, and obviously we have to be careful that they don't succeed. But given all that, I'm fairly, if I may say, I'm happy at what's going on and reasonably optimistic that we will prevail even in this kind of a contest. Not alone, by the way. I've heard a lot of people say, alone, alone, alone. I'm sorry, not alone, but it's part of an alliance. Right. And that alliance is being developed by Prime Minister Modi and other leaders who are openly backing him, to the dismay of George Soros.
So, if I understand correctly, we are on the right path. But extending that, Madhavji, like I want to go to the fundamentals. When we say the idea of India, the story, Professor Nalapat brought about 2014, post 2014. So there are things which are happening, which we see the acceptance of India growing, and there is a idea of India which is forming in the world. So is it more like India is conducive for a certain kind of business, and India is kind of trying to replace China in terms of manufacturing? All that's more of business side. But the thing I want you to talk about is these ideas of India are stripped of our civilizational ethos. We were under the colonial power for 200 plus years, and then under the shadows of the Western centric worldview. But today, no doubt, 2014, we are seeing a lot of changes which is happening, and especially under PM Modi, the foreign policy is very robust and very active. But is this idea of India taking away our civilizational ethos, what we want to portray ourselves as?
Yes, very much. Before I respond to you, I want to make one humble submission. Nobody should criticize us. Whoever criticizes us is a part of a large conspiracy, is the mindset of the victims. I'm repeatedly saying that we have to get out of that mindset. Ignore them or respond to them, but India's story is much bigger than George Soros or New York Times or somebody else today. Please remember that. It may suit our headlines, but that is not India's narrative in the world today. Fortunately, I also travel to many countries. There will be questions, we have to respond to them. Narrative bereft of reality cannot be created, to remember. You have to, in the earlier session, the last point, that you need to create a united India to create a narrative outside about India.
Quite right.
So there won't be a narrative that is completely bereft of the reality. So you fight on religion here, you fight on many other things here, and you want to build a different narrative elsewhere. That doesn't happen that way. If you have a reality, if there is misunderstanding, then you can improve that understanding there, you can build a new narrative. But coming to that very important point that you are asking, apart from economics, but I want to say one more thing here. India's story will be really heard with utmost attention only and only if we can next 6 years focus on India's economy.
Quite right.
Build a strong economy, then do whatever you want to do. World will listen to you. World may criticize you. World may attack you still, but it will listen to you. You have to build a strong economic power. India has a strong economic power. In that sense, what 1980s was for China, 2020s should be for India. There was the reference to Deng Xiaoping, hiding the capabilities, biding the time, striking when right. You have to prepare for next 10 years. You have to prepare India for next 10 years. Then your narrative will be held. Having said it, today, a major contribution of Modi's government in the last 8 years to this whole discourse in the world is to bring that idea of civilizational nationhood back into discourse. Do you know that Foreign Affairs Journal has run a full edition on the new discourse on nationalism? Nationalism, which the West has all along been portraying as negative, fundamentalist, retrograde, etc., etc. Today, the West is saying, no, civilizational idea of nations is probably something we have to accept. A very important contribution of this government in last 8 years, despite criticism, despite all that propaganda, is that today the intellectual world, the academic world, is sitting up and acknowledging that apart from this whole idea of civic nationalism, constitution-driven, constitution-centric nationalism, there is something called civilizational nationalism. So, a major debate over what is the root of national consciousness. Why this subject is important is because today large parts of the world, especially the Western world, Europe and West in general, Europe in particular, are faced with this big challenge of immigration. Immigration from Arab world and poor Islamic countries. It's causing serious sociological problems, challenges in those countries. People are standing up in those countries. And the West, the same media we talked about, which we think that is building an anti-India global narrative, it tried to build a massive narrative against those groups or those parties which were standing up. And you know what happened after 8 years or 10 years today? Those forces which stand for a greater civilizational, cultural, national identity are the ruling parties in many countries. One of those prime ministers is coming to India to inaugurate the ORF Raisina dialogue, Italy. Global discourse is changing. Changing because of the lead shown by India and its leader, its prime minister. So we are actually on a very important trajectory today. We are rising as an economic power. We are standing up as a lead country in the global south. But we are setting a new, very important academic global discourse on national identities that's going to play a very important role in coming years and decades.
Just extension of the same thing. Like, I happened to meet one of the participants of this Indo-ASEAN Youth Summit. See, no doubt we have civilizational ties with Southeast Asia, but the image in the common people there, I'm not just talking about the political class, the people in Southeast Asia, the image about India is formed from what they consume through Bollywood, through movies, or what they read in international journals and newspapers. The sense I got is that India today is more like whatever India was formed in 1947. So the idea of India outside is still like, it's a multicultural society and, stripped of our Hindu identity. So that is what, whatever is narrated through Bollywood, through, newspapers and journals. So how do we come out of this? I mean,
The most successful movies in entire Southeast Asia in the last couple of years are, number one was Bahubali, number two was RRR, Triple R. In fact, Western media started writing about Triple R, saying that it is actually portraying anti-European narrative. They are worried that you are setting an anti-Europe narrative. So, it is true that sometimes, movies present a different picture about it. But then there are movies which present a very different picture, very good picture also. And today these movies have a massive, massive influence over large parts of Southeast Asia. In fact, you mentioned about ASEAN India Youth Summit. ASEAN youth leaders were all here for a 4-day summit. So we asked some of those ambassadors about who should come as a special attraction speaker. You know the names we got. They wanted Junior NTR to come. I asked why Junior NTR? No, Triple R is very popular in our country. They want Junior NTR. They want these people. Nobody asked me to bring Amir Khan or somebody. So there is a different understanding about India. Bollywood and movies have an influence, but don't overestimate that influence.
Right. Yeah, that's very promising. Talking about this narrative, and you studied China very deeply and you write about it, including your article today about how China is trying to stymie India's growth. Can China kind of serve as a model to create a narrative? The kind of investments they have done in, buying out studios or newspaper spaces, the way they're trying to influence technologies in all sectors, whether it's, filing patents. China is there everywhere today. And that's how they're all trying to push their civilizational narrative. So is China a good model, or should India have its own model? Is India, evolving its own model of creating its narrative?
Well, the first point is I'd like to agree with what Ram is saying about the fact that, what some of us have been saying is, let's assume that we have only 5,000 years, maybe a lot more, of our history. But these 5,000 years, we have to take the whole of it as important. In a lot of our pedagogy, the last 300 years has been important.
Yeah.
The succeeding 300-400 years have been okay. The previous years have been myth, dismissed as myth.
Yeah, we are seen more as a constitutional state formed after 1947, and every civilization ethos are kind of forgotten in the international narrative. That's what I was coming at.
The fact of the matter is that people are people, and like it or not, all of us have a civilization inside us. And we have a unique civilization here in this, in India and its surroundings. But my point is, we need to escape this prism of South Asia, where Chinese are, frankly, as I said, I don't blame the Chinese for trying to damage us, because we are the only power that can really displace them in Asia. Like Russia, I don't blame Joe Biden for trying to push the Europeans to commit harakiri by attacking Russia, because Russia is the one power that can challenge America and Europe. But, the reality of the situation is that yes, there is a lot that we can learn from them. But, in India, avsarvad, opportunism is negative. Sacrifice, very positive. We have the example of the Mahatma, very saintly individual. He sacrificed everything. He sacrificed the futures of his children. One of his children died as a beggar on the road, but he sacrificed that. The reality is that, as I have understood our culture and traditions going back, I don't quite understand where this concept of sacrifice came from. Because the concept of economic development, the concept of human happiness, the concept of progress was very innate in the cultural psyche of India. So this concept of sacrifice, as Ram correctly says, the point is to make progress. Now the Chinese used the opportunity of Cold War 1.0 between mainly the US and China to tag along and ensure that they joined in the fall of the Soviet Union. Today we have Cold War 2.0, and the reality is that presents an opportunity for us. For example, decoupling. CEOs may not like it because a CEO landing in China is treated much better than a CEO landing in India. You come into an airport, you have a problem, your driver is not available, your flight is whatever. But in China, you're met at the aircraft door and you're listening and you feel a very important person and the hotel suite is ready for you and everything. But the fact of the matter is that decoupling is becoming a reality because artificial intelligence is a crucial part of modern warfare. AI feeds on data. Unfortunately, India has given away a lot of data to China. I think under Modi, some attempt has been made to reduce that flow, but it's there. Now, in that situation of decoupling, we are the obvious default option if we get some of our policy fundamentals in order. We have the people. In Mangalore, you have let's say, 100-kilometer belt around Mangalore. I'm not saying 100 kilometers because Udupi and Manipal will be part of that. But you'll find a tremendous wealth of talent to create even a Silicon Valley. Now there is a decoupling that is taking place. But for that decoupling to take place, you have to convince them that you are not going to tango with China in the future. That you're not afraid of China. Two things. One, never tango. Two, you're not afraid of China. And three, you have the capability of defending yourself against China. This messaging has got to be very, very sharp and clear. If you are very diplomatic about it, and President Biden is very diplomatic, there's no Cold War 2.0, it doesn't really exist. Blinken tries to say no, it doesn't exist, and frankly the most stupid thing that they're doing is trying to go to Xi Jinping and ask him to stop a war which Putin has launched, which benefits them most of all.
Right.
Now why the Chinese would do that, you have for Blinken and Biden to answer. But the fact of the matter is, I have a feeling that we are still, a significant part of our policy machinery is still in the trap of the 1970s, 1980s, etc. We have to understand that in this world, you have to make your stand clear. One, you have to show that you can defend against China, and if necessary, as correctly been said, go after China. I'd like to be, in a sense, I'm not as provocative usually as Bharat is, but in my opinion, one of the great disasters that happened to India was the loss of Tibet. They are controlling all our water resources, and slowly by slowly, they are tightening their grip so that less and less water is beginning to flow. Frankly, they don't care if Pakistan, which is running behind them, is destroyed, Bangladesh, whatever, so long as they can do that to India. They are slowly trying to strangulate us. And a large part of their success is because of the fact that they have control over Tibet. Now, is it possible militarily to ensure that that situation is reversed? Possibly not alone, but with somebody else. Perhaps a system by which you have an activity designed for that, because it is a threat to the world if India is in a situation where we are in a bad way vis-a-vis China, especially regarding their control over water, etc. the world would be benefited if India remains strong. And it is very clear, as I said, I have high respect for Chinese leadership. They are very clear-sighted people. They are very ruthless people. What they tell you is different from what they tell themselves. And the reality,
Right.
the fact is that we have to be prepared for this attack, adversarial attack on India. And the second fact is that they have been trying to basically tell the West about this horrible Hindu community. Now, in every part of the Western world, you have Hindus. There are no horrible Hindus. Long back, in the late 80s and 90s, I went to Europe and Germany and all that, and I say, you are welcoming everybody from Eastern Europe, even guys who are gangsters. You have software engineers from Chennai and mechanical engineers from Hyderabad. The door is shut to them. You are shutting doors to the brightest guys and opening it to people who are going to be a problem for you. Now, even bigger problems have landed there because of their flawed immigration policy. But the fact is, we have to be very clear. In a world that is taking sides, on which side we are on. And we are on the side of democracy. As Ram correctly said, the BJP has lost a lot of elections. And, although in my personal view, I still think 2024, the BJP will come through, largely because the personality of Prime Minister Modi and a lot of his policies that are being felt by the people, if not by the intelligentsia. But, so this is we have to get ourselves ready to be the default option. There are still way too many obstacles. There are too many, if I may say so, too many bureaucratic stages that are still there, in which the vision of even the Prime Minister is being, I would say, not being diluted in operationalization. As has correctly been said, there's no point in having capability unless you can use it. You can't use it unless you have the instruments that are ready to use it. Now, in that point of view, administrative reform is something that's a work in progress. I hope it accelerates. But in my view, from the very beginning, from his first step, as ensuring that you can sign your own documents, you don't have to have some guested officer sign for you. The fundamental track of Prime Minister Modi is to give power back to the people and not to the nanny state. So, but the fact is, those who are running the nanny state, those who are empowering themselves to the nanny state, and I'm sorry to say those, and that includes people in business, that includes people in government, who are enriching themselves as a result of the nanny state, they are making a fight of it. And slowly by slowly, progress is being made. Slowly by slowly. Which is why for me, as someone who's not in politics, it's important to have this dispensation run a 15-year term. Because that change that has been initiated in 2014 will not be completed in 10 years. It needs 15 years. By the end of 15 years, it will be self-sustaining, irreversible. That's not the case now. But for that to happen, in my view, a lot of signaling also has to take place. Ram has very correctly said, who are these guys who are attacking India? The BBC, nobody no sensible person in Britain ever takes the BBC seriously. Frankly, if we had not banned that serial, and if there had not been a huge hoopla about the BBC, it would have died a natural death, if you ask me. Now, the Adani factor. Everybody tried to say PM and Adani are linked to each other. From the first second I said, there is no link at all, and the government is not going to lift a little finger to help Mr. Adani. He's on his own. That's exactly what happened. The Prime Minister didn't do anything. Because why should he? He's not going to get involved in a business dispute. He has nothing to do with any businessman. He didn't do it. So the fact is, if these guys are experts in football, you are an expert in cricket, play cricket and beat them at cricket. In Cold War 2.0, we have the batsmen, we have the bowlers to play excellent cricket. Football was Cold War 1.0. That old discourse in which even in America and Europe, China is the hope and India is somehow a threat. And secondly, about the Hindu religion. Now, I am very strongly in favor of the removal of Article 370. And my point was, if you like it so much, why on earth can't you make certain areas of Detroit free and don't allow anybody to settle in there unless they belong to a particular theology? You're not doing it. Now, if you believe so much that a uniform civil code is so anti-minority, why don't you permit your own minorities to marry more women? Why are you enforcing this monogamy law on them when you say it is extremely filled with hate? We have a very strong case. We should not escape that case by trying to run away from a meeting in which somebody is coming who's talking nonsense. By sheer logic, show them they're talking nonsense. And what I like about Ram, frankly, and I've been following Ram for quite some time, his activities in some parts of the world, he very coolly and calmly accepts whatever is thrown at him and then points out how absurd it is. Now, yesterday, for example, a very important point was made by Aravind Neelakantan about Ayodhya. 25, 26 mosques there, completely untouched by what is called a frenzied, hateful, Muslim-hating, mosque-destroying mob, which did nothing except where there was the birthplace of Lord Ram. That was all. So again, where I mentioned Bharat, I've also mentioned that in my column. I was very struck by what Arvind said. I must confess I didn't know. It didn't really occur to me about this thing. But the point is, if you have a strong narrative, don't respond to the other person's nonsensical narrative. Go by your own narrative and you will succeed. I think that's the point that Ram was making, and I fully agree with him.
So,
About your question of whether China is, are we heading towards a Sino-centric world order? That's what I think you wanted to know. I would say, in terms of ideology, if you are talking about, no. Even the so-called Confucius institutes, China is winding up one after the other now, realizing that it cannot spread its false ideology of, of an authoritarian state order. That's basically what they wanted to promote. That, you only want people to be happy. They don't need to really have any political rights. They need to have economic rights. Let them enjoy a happy life. Don't ask for political rights. So that kind of a model, that kind of an authoritarian ideology is not being accepted. Even in our neighborhood, Nepal, they set up several institutes. They are all being wound up now one by one. In fact, most of them have already been wound up. So as an ideology, China is not going to really gain. It gained a lot of traction earlier, but it is now on the wane. It is receding now. But where China is winning is in its military, economic, and technological superiority. That is where the real challenge is. India must today prepare itself, brace itself in all these three areas. India has to grow economically very strong. India has to become a technological superpower. In that, we should not become what Japan was in 1990s. Or Korea and Taiwan were in later period. In the sense that we should not become simple copycat manufacturers. Manufacturing is important. I'm not against manufacturing. It's important. But assuming tomorrow China-Taiwan war happens, the first major casualty is going to be the semiconductor industry. And do you know that 55% of the entire chip making happens from Taiwan? Once Taiwan is lost, that industry has to run away from there when it comes to India. Are we ready? For chip making, you need 24-hour high quality power at cheaper cost. Do we give that? This combination is available in India? Nowhere. So, China, where it is winning is in this advantage. They have excellent technological superiority today in cyber, in other areas. They have achieved certain successes. So there lies the challenge, not in narrative. Country after country is today rejecting. Pew research is there. Pew has done a global study of sentiments about China. And its research said 70% of the world is anti-China. 70%. And in the West, in Europe and West, the anti-China sentiment is above 90%. So China is not winning the narrative war, but China, where it is winning is because of its power. So that is where we need to tackle it. Since Professor Nalapat talked about alliances, let me tell you, in that, the 21st century, although this session is not about geopolitics, still, since it came up in your discussion. So, 21st century, the power axis is in our neighborhood in Indo-Pacific. That is why so much is happening in Indo-Pacific. And remember, in Indo-Pacific, India somehow has not really paid proper attention until now. Now, today we are a part of the Quad. But still, we are westward ho. Our whole attention is on Europe and America. Right. We have certain advantages, we should continue. But India must turn its greater attention to this neighborhood, because this is the most happening region for next 100 years. Power axis has shifted from Pacific Atlantic to Indo-Pacific today. It is here that global competition is going to happen, is already happening. What will you do here? That decides what will happen to India and what will happen to China, obviously. Here the main players today are the Western powers and China. Will India become a major player here, or only an alliance partner, or India will have its own vision for it? We have one vision for it, which Prime Minister Modi has articulated at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2017, in which he said that this region is the most important region. India, ASEAN is central to this Indo-Pacific region. ASEAN centrality we must accept. So that's why I don't think Southeast Asia should be just simply brushed aside. ASEAN is the world's fifth or sixth, I think eighth or ninth largest economy today, but by 2030 it is poised to emerge as fourth or fifth largest economy. ASEAN is a grouping, I'm saying, not one country in any one country there. It is going to grow as a big economy. With China, we have trade deficit of 100 billion. There was this mention earlier. It was 80 billion 2 years ago. It is 100 billion today, and it's growing. But with ASEAN, our entire trade is not even 40-50 billion. So we need to strengthen these ties in order for us to contain China. In that sense, ASEAN centrality in Indo-Pacific region must be acknowledged. In the same breath, we should also acknowledge and understand India's centrality to the Indian Ocean region. So India's centrality to Indian Ocean and ASEAN's centrality to Indo-Pacific region. Together, we should build the narrative in this region. Then I think we can try our best to contain China in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I just want to add a small point to this, which is that in my view, South Asia, we are actually the hub of Southern Asia.
Right.
That is the entire arc of land from the Middle East, what we call West Asia, to, as he was saying, ASEAN and Southeast Asia. It's not just South Asia, it's Southern Asia. That is India's, that is India's actual, if I may say so. We are the pivot of that. And what Ram was saying, this in same way to the West as well, Asia. They got plenty, they got capital, they got other situation. They need a certain, huge infusion of educational and other resources to ensure that the younger people there have the mindsets and equipment needed for the modern world. So Southern Asia is basically, let's stop talking of South Asia.
Right.
It's Southern Asia. And that goes right from the borders of Turkey, right up to, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, all that. Second point I want to raise is technology. Absolutely right. The Chinese have, for the first time, they are facing a setback because the technology sanctions that have come on them, and one of the good things that Biden has done, not too many, but at least this one, he has imposed some very tough sanctions on them. It was Prime Minister Modi who did this first regarding banning some Chinese apps, you remember. That's been now multiplying. And as a consequence, Chinese technology is suffering. Because the realization is very clear in India and any other country that's likely to confront China, including Taiwan, may I say. Right. And if I may say so, I think the Taiwanese are working very, very hard at ensuring that they have enough cyber aggressive capability, and that the Chinese are signaled that. so that, because a lot of Chinese equipment now is sophisticated. And when you're sophisticated, you're vulnerable to something like that. And the Taiwanese are acquiring those weapons. I'm sure we and I hope that we are all as well. But the point is, a point is going to be reached in which, if you want to produce an electric car in China, you can sell it only in China or Russia or Iran or Pakistan. You can't sell it anywhere else because of the Cold War 2.0 market limitations on high technology exports, which is being imposed on China one by one. So I'm very hopeful that this story of, irreversible growth of China is going to be reversed. And I'm not interested in the story of irreversible growth of India. I'd like to see irreversible growth. And in my view, it's possible by around 2029.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. In conclusion, see, we spoke about China and the Western narrative and what India, how India should progress. In conclusion, if we can summarize, like, why should India, the world believe in the India story? If I can have just 1 minute from each of you.
So
what is that India has to offer, and why should the world believe in India going forward?
You see, India is the fastest growing economy, number one, in the world. World listens to you. Number two, you are the most successful democracy in the world. World respects you. Number three, you are the most ancient cultural, civilizational nation with a great value system to offer to the entire world. So world is bound to respect you, but in this order. If you don't build a strong economy here, if you keep your people hungry, if you keep your people jobless, next two things, nobody is going to respect you. They may respect, even Vivekananda was respected, but not India. Right. So you need to build a strong economy. On a lighter note, Monoji, electric cars from China are omnipresent from Nepal to Sri Lanka to Bangladesh today. We have to be careful. Their economic influence is growing in our neighborhood.
Yeah, they're entering India as well.
India we are not allowing, we are not permitting.
No,
but
thank God.
Comments,
I simply want to say, very, very, very clearly that if you go to the United States or you go to Europe or you go to these countries, those that are dealing with, with cosmic issues. Foreign policy of India, in my view, was very cosmic in the 1950s, and it was based on romance and not on hard realities. Now, in America, for example, the Department of Defense is a very strong proponent of good India-US relations. The Department of State, and Ram has got very good contacts there. Those chaps are in an airy-fairy world, For them, the more hardcore, real their activities are, the more they are geared towards facing actual challenges, whether on technology or, very importantly, again, pardon me, but going back to what Sunday Guardian wrote about 4 years ago, that there is a conscious effort in India and the United States to use the internet and to use chat forums and to use these WhatsApp groups to create a distance, to create a tension between the extremes, to grow the extremes at the expense of the moderate middle. In our society, in American society, there's a conscious effort going on to ensure that extreme views slowly start taking over from moderate views. And that is where I'm happy that every speaker here has made it very, very clear that, if you're either an Indian nationalist or you're not a nationalist. You can't be a nationalist based on a religion at all. It has got to be a nationalism of India, all of India. And from that point of view, I'd like to say it's very important to understand that social media, one big problem in social media that I'm foreseeing, especially you look at TikTok in China, it's totally different from TikTok in America. TikTok in America is toxic. TikTok in China is very, very anodyne. You have to be very careful about that kind of a situation, and you have to have societal stability so that we understand all 5,000 years of history belong to us. You can't forget 4,300 years or 4,400 years. You can't forget 300 years. You can't forget another 300 years. All of it is important. But in this narrative, I'd like to say, I think a very big beginning has been made here by this government. Archaeological Survey of India. 1/3 of their, significant sites were the grave sites of British soldiers who died fighting Indians who were fighting for independence. They are very significant sites. But whether they are significant to Indians or to British, till I think about 6 months ago, nobody asked.
I think we are running out of time, Professor. I mean, we can continue this discussion. As I said earlier, this is a topic which we can discuss throughout the day for, hundreds of questions. So I thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Ram Madhav ji. And sorry, actually we run out of time. We don't have time for questions, but we can surely discuss with our eminent panelists after this session. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this very impactful session. May I now request MB Puranik ji to hand over a token of appreciation to our honorable guest speakers.